Hello everybody, welcome to Catherine Sews. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know, I spent 20 years being a high school sewing teacher and I loved every minute of it. And my students made some absolutely wonderful things, but they also made some things that were not quite there yet. So I gave it some thought and I kind of boiled down 10 beginner mistakes that can make your sewing look kind of crappy. So today I want to show you what those 10 beginner mistakes are and show you ways to avoid them that will make such a giant difference in how your sewing looks. So let's just jump right into the first one, and that is to choose a thread color that's a good match. Now, as you're a beginning sewer, you're not going to have a whole huge collection of threads. You might just have one blue thread for your blue project, but if it's not the right blue, it can look really terrible. It's definitely worth it to buy thread that matches.
When you're trying to decide, just lay the thread out on top of the fabric. When I just look at those spools, I would have thought that one was the best bet. But when I lay out a thread, it looks a bit too dark. It stands out a bit. These ones tend to blend in better. When you're trying to decide between two that are both almost good, the general rule is go with the one that's a little bit darker. You definitely don't want to go too dark. Now, you can sometimes use a contrasting thread, but in general, it does not look good. A contrast thread is going to show every little wobble, and there's a couple other adjustments you'd want to make if you do want to use a contrast thread. One is that it should be a little bit heavier. A top stitching thread will look much better than a regular skinny thread if you're going to use it as a decorative detail. And the other thing is you probably want to increase your stitch length. But again, that's a little bit more advanced because it will show every little wobble. You're definitely better off with a thread that matches and is maybe one shade darker.
Now, matching your thread color is important in the top thread, but it's also important in your bobbin. Sometimes it's the top thread that's going to show. In the example of like a top stitch, it'll be the top thread that shows. But most often, if we do a machine sewn hem, it's the bobbin thread that's going to show. And they should be the same, and they should match the fabric really well. So home sewers who are just getting started probably don't have a big selection of bobbins, and you're going to be tempted to wind some color of a bobbin on top of some other color of a bobbin because you just don't have any empty bobbins. That's not good. Don't do that. First of all, you want to wind a full bobbin for any project. You need at least one full bobbin. And second, it's just not a great way to store your thread colors on a bobbin. How are you ever going to use that inside color unless you unwind all the outside color? It's just not good. Some people also say it affects the tension. I don't know about that, but I just know it's just not a good habit. So buy yourself a good amount, maybe 20 or 24 empty bobbins so you have a good color on each. Now, thread color on your serger is a slightly different story. I don't expect you to have a massive collection of serger cones. So if you want to just keep basic colors on your serger, that is totally fine. If you want to do most of your serging in white or black, unless it's going to show, you're fine. But as you do build up your stock of thread, it is nice when your serging thread matches your garment. Now, as you build up a big store of thread and you keep it for years and years, does thread go bad? Yes, it eventually can decay, but that takes decades. Here's an example. I have no idea how long I've had this, where it came from. It could be 40 years old. I really don't know. But if it's that hard to break, it's still good. Here's one. I used to always buy that size of thread. So this one probably is 30, 35 years old. It's a little easier to break. It'll still give a garment many years of wear. It's not going to break down while you're sewing or while you're wearing your garment. It really does take decades. Most threads are poly cotton, and we all know how long it takes polyester to break down. So don't worry, build up your collection of threads. You can keep it for years and years. And as long as it doesn't break too easily when you do that, you'll be good. The second beginner mistake that most new sewers make is not sewing straight, right? That's the number one skill you really need to master right at the get-go. And so how do you sew straight? And it's all about where your eye is tracking. Most people watch the needle, right? Something that's moving like that, we tend to watch it. We don't want to put our fingers near it. We're kind of gluing our eyes to the needle. The needle's going to go up and down whether you watch it or not. So don't stare at the needle. Stare at your guideline, whatever guideline you're using, and you have to use one. Most of the time, the guideline will be on your needle plate. In the US, the most common guideline you would use is the 5/8 line. In Canada and Europe, the most common guideline you'd use is the 15 line, or what I call the 15 line. It's 15 millimeters from the needle, which is very close to 5/8 of an inch.
My eye just stays right here, guiding my edge right along that 15 line as I sew.
So your eye tracks the guideline. Sometimes when you're sewing on the interior of a piece, you can't see that 15 line or 5/8 line. So then you use a guideline that's actually on your presser foot. You might run the edge of your presser foot along a seam when you're top stitching. You might run the little notch in the center of your presser foot right along the ditch that you're trying to sew in. So the guideline is massively important, and that's where your eye needs to stay. Number 3 is backtacks. Some people call it backstitching, but it's how we tie a knot when we're sewing, right? So you sew about 3 stitches and then go back 3 stitches and then continue your seam and do the same thing at the end. So beginners either skip the backtack and just go, and then that means your seams can pull apart easily. That's not great. And then other people, once they realize the importance of a bacttack, they do giant backtacks. So they might do like 15 stitches, and that giant bacttack just looks terrible. It's really hard to hide that. It will show and it will look terrible. So a little small bacttack, just 3 stitches, that's all you need.
Another thing about backtacks is that it's good practice to hold your thread for the first few stitches so that it doesn't get all tangled up underneath and give you a messy bacttack on the bottom. 3 stitches forward, 3 back, pick up that thread again so you can give a little tug and it doesn't get all tangled underneath. And then you can let the thread go.
If you're doing a bacttack that's really in an important place that is definitely going to show, there are sneaky ways to do a bacttack right on the spot, but that's definitely a more advanced technique. So beginner mistake number 4 has to do with finishing your edges. So when we sew, we have to clean up the edge of the fabric on the inside. The inside really should look just as neat and nice as the outside. And so beginners either skip that step. Yes, okay, maybe if you're sewing a hoodie with fleece, it's not going to unravel. It's just, people who've been sewing for a long time really want to see all those edges finished. And so if you're a beginner, you probably don't have a serger, but I promise you, you will love it as soon as you're able to treat yourself to a serger. You will love it and it will up your game incredibly. But if you don't have a serger, you still want to finish your edges. So you can use a zigzag stitch on the edge of a woven fabric.
A lot of machines default to a zigzag stitch that's quite short. So I like to bring that length number up to at least 3. So that is a nicer zigzag in my opinion. I like it better a little bit longer. And your zigzag should go right over the edge to seal that. So you're on the fabric and off and on the fabric and off. So right over the edge like that gives you a neat and clean finish. There is nothing wrong with that. But if you are able to treat yourself to a serger, you will love it. So pro, right? You're going to love that.
If you are doing a knit, most often the recommendation is a double line of sewing, one right at your 5/8 line or 15 line, and one closer to the edge. And with knits, that's a really good idea. That's a nice way to stabilize those edges, to reduce the amount of stretch so that the thread doesn't break when you stretch it. It also keeps the edges together and prevents them from rolling.
So for knits, a double line works really well, but you can also just do your zigzag edge.
So finishing your edges, even if you don't have a serger, is really, really key. Now, if you do have a serger, you need to know how to serge straight. So sometimes you're serging 2 layers together when you're finishing a seam. Sometimes you're just serging 1 layer around the edge in the example of a hem or a casing at a waistband. Quite often we want to be able to sew along a serged edge, like in the example of a hem, or I'll show you here, the angled edges of a hoodie pocket. If you don't serge it straight, you're not going to be able to sew it straight.
So to be able to serge straight, I'm just going to nudge up that presser foot on the serger and slip my edge under and just bring my edge right to that blade. There should be a little gap here that I can always see. And so that is my guideline. I want to bring my edge right to that guideline. So it should be nice and straight like that. Because with the serger, if you're not careful, you will cut a lot and you'll make a very wobbly edge. If something is already sewn in the round like this, and so I don't have a corner to start with, it's no problem. Same idea. I'm just going to get my edge flat, nudge up the presser foot, but make sure it's going straight. I don't want to come in and take a big bite and then make my way back to the edge. Just get it under and make it straight and go. I'll overlap where I started and then chain off. And there you go, still nice and straight.
And you know what? Sewing patterns are never going to tell you when to serge. You just need to know for each seam you sew, you're going to sew it, serge it, or finish the edge with a zigzag, and then press it. Every seam you sew, serge, press, and sometimes top stitch. Beginner mistake number 5 is letting mistakes just go. Now, I know it's frustrating if you make a mistake and you're like, oh, I have to pick those stitches out now. You do. If you make a mistake that's going to show, yeah, you got to fix that mistake. If you have puckers in your seam or gaps or holes, you have to fix that. Please don't just let that go. If it only looks bad on the inside and the outside looks good, then you know what? I'm not going to judge you, but if there's mistakes on the outside, puckery seams or gaps or holes in seams, those have to be fixed. And the time to fix them is immediately. You don't go ahead and serge and press and top stitch that seam when it has mistakes in it. Your seam ripper is now your best friend. And if you've got a puckery section in your seam, you'll probably have to undo the seam maybe twice or 3 times the size of that mistake so that you can disperse that fullness evenly and sew it again.
In this case, my puckers meant that my bottom edges didn't end up matching. So really, I should undo the whole seam here and redo it to make sure my matching points meet. Remember to do a back tack on top of where your stitching is still good to secure it. So much better, and now I can be proud of my work.
It's so worth it. It usually only takes 5 or 10 minutes to fix that error, and it makes a massive difference in how your project is going to look. Beginner mistake number 6, I've kind of already hinted at that we finish edges and press as we go. Every seam is sew, serge, or finish your edges, and press. When I say press, there's a difference between pressing and ironing. You would iron a wrinkled shirt. Ironing is getting rid of wrinkles. Pressing is setting in creases. When you press a seam that you just sewed, you're pressing the seam allowance in one direction, usually to the back or down, and you're also setting in the thread. If you were to pick out those stitches after you've pressed it, your thread will be wiggly because it's been set into that shape. It makes your whole seam lay nice and flat and look really pro. So when you've got 2 seams, they get sewn together. Those 2 seams absolutely need to have their edges finished and to be pressed flat before you can cross those seams nicely. You just can't get back in there after you've sewn the ends of those seams. You can't get back in there to finish those edges nicely or to press them in the proper direction. They're set. So we finish edges and press as we go. Beginner mistake number 7 is when you do have two seams that should be matching, they really should be matching. Now you will be forgiven if those seams are off by a little bit, but as you progress, you're going to really want to try to nail those seams together. So when you're pinning pieces together, first of all, use lots of pins as a beginner. And second, you pin your matching points together first. Pin corners together, pin notches together, and pin seams that should match together. I'm thinking like the side seam of a hoodie. You'd pin your corners, top and bottom, and you'd pin that underarm seam to match. And then you pin in between. If you just start pinning at one point and make your way to the other point, it's never going to work out. You always have to pin your matching points first and then pin in between. You can use pins or clips, but when I am matching up seams, that's when I want to use a pin because I can kind of weave that pin in and out of the seam and take that pin out at the last second. I personally don't like sewing over pins, especially on a computerized machine. That needle's going to go down where it's going to go down. It's not going to kind of glide over a pin the way a mechanical machine would. A computerized machine, that needle's going down if there's a pin there or not. So you can end up with more broken needles. So I just take that pin out at the last second so I know my seam is at least very closely matching. If you're getting into quilting, quilters have an awesome trick where they press seam allowances in opposite ways so that you can just snuggle those seam allowances against each other, and it really helps you nail those seams together. Generally on garment construction, we press all of the seams toward the back. So you do have seam allowance laying on top of seam allowance, but I'll show you how you can kind of weave your pin into that seam, and that'll help it to stay matched.
On a longer seam, it's even more important to pin your matching points first, but that's the idea. You're going to pin corners, pin notches, pin or clip, whatever you prefer. But at a matching seam, that's where I want to stick my pin into the seam on one side and then into the seam there, and then back out through the seam and back out through the seam on this side. So that pin, do you see what I mean? It's kind of weaving in between, and it's really nailing those two seams together. Good?
So that when I sew it, even with my poorly matched thread, at the last second, I'll take that out. And then my seam matches so nicely. Beginner mistake number 8 is also something we do as we go, and that is fitting. As soon as your garment is to a point where you can put it on your body and check the fit, do it. If you're making a hoodie, let's say, as soon as you've sewn your shoulder seams, you can even kind of try it there, but definitely once you've sewn the side seams, you want to put that on your body and make sure you like the fit, right? It's so much easier to deal with the fit in the construction stages rather than trying to deal with it at the end after everything is all together and sewn and serged and pressed. The time to fit is as you're making a garment. Now, my favorite way to do fitting is inside out. I turn everything inside out so I can easily pin away any excess. Now, that works if you are pretty symmetrical, and most of us are. Well, most of us are mostly symmetrical. If you know you've got any big differences in your symmetry, then maybe that's not going to work for you. But I would say unless it is like a super fitted garment, like a bodycon dress, most of us are pretty okay with pinning something inside out and flipping it around. If you have a dress that you like the fit of, try putting it on inside out. Does it still work for you? It probably does, right? So doing your fitting inside out just makes it so much easier, and you probably are symmetrical enough. Beginner mistake number 9 is all to do with hems. Most beginner sewers, in fact, I'm going to say 99.9% of beginning sewers, like to do a machine sewn hem. There's sort of a dread of the whole idea of doing a hand sewn hem. Hand sewn hems are beautiful and quite satisfying to do, but they would be reserved for, a dress pant or a skirt, something that's not super casual. I think a great beginner project is a hoodie and sweatpants. I recommend that as a beginner's project. It is a skill builder, very forgiving, and super comfy that you can just wear at home. But when you're doing hems on something like sweatpants or pajama pants, that's another good beginner project. You finish the edge of that hem first, and then when you turn it up, you sew up high on that finished edge.
The easiest way is to have the pant leg or sleeve or whatever it is right side out so that I can have this circle of the hem facing up so I can see what's going on. If I have it inside out, then I have to have this circle of the hem underneath. I can't see it, and it's much more awkward. So have it right side out. You can sometimes use your free arm, but I usually find that the arm is still too big and this doesn't glide around it easily. So this way with the circle up and your presser foot going inside the circle is just easier. Start or stop at an inseam rather than a side seam so your back tack is more hidden. And then you're sewing on top of your finished edge. This is a knit, so I'm giving it a little bit of a stretch as I sew so that that thread doesn't break when the garment is stretched. There are different stitches you can use, but you can stick with the straight stitch for most knits as long as you give it that little stretch as you go. So because I serged straight and I measured and pinned, I know this edge is straight, and so it can be my guideline. I measured and pinned 3 centimeters or 1.25 inches, so it's a good deep hem. And once I give that a final press, that'll look great.
You never sew your hem close to the folded edge because it'll just fall back down, right? So I see that a lot in beginning sewers where they turn their edge and then sew right along the fold. That, first of all, doesn't look good. It looks terrible, and then the hem falls back down anyway.
What some beginners do is, first of all, they do too skinny of a hem, and then they go right on the fold. So that gives you that really wiggly edge. It just looks rotten, and the hem can just still fall down. Now, at least I serged my edge. Quite often, beginners will forget to finish their edge and then sew on a raw edge, which has no strength, no substance to it, and it can also just pull right down. So make sure you finished your edge, and then you sew on top of that finished edge. And it's so much nicer.
And finally, beginner mistake number 10 has to do with the finishing. And when you're done your last sewing step, you're not done. You still need to trim any threads. That is so important. I have had things handed into me to mark that are drenched in dripping threads, and I just hand it back and say, like, are you trying to kill me? No, I'm not marking that. You have to trim your threads. You would never go to a store. I don't care how cheap that store is. You would never see in a store a finished garment that has threads hanging off of it. Never, right? So you're not done till you trim your threads and do a final press. Any hem you sew is never going to look great until you give it that final press. It makes a massive difference.
And pressing is just so satisfying. So nice.
So you're not done your sewing until you're done your finishing, which is trimming your threads and doing your final press. Okay, I'm going to put all of those together now, and I'm going to show you a hoodie pocket sewn really badly with badly matching thread, not straight, not correcting mistakes, really making it a mess, and then show you a nicely sewn hoodie pocket done a little bit better. And you'll see that those 10 little things make a massive difference. So let me show you a good one and a bad one.
Let's do the bad one first. So here's my edge. I'm just going to fold that over. I don't need to press it. I hate pressing. Yuck. And this is my only blue thread. It's good enough. Nobody's going to notice. Oopsie, I broke my thread. Now I'm already frustrated. Now I didn't serge it very straight. But that'll do, won't it? Awesome. Here we go. Beautiful. Here's the body of my hoodie. It's got a little stain on it, but nobody's going to notice. And then my pocket's going to go right on there. I know I have to turn this top edge under, and I'm doing a good job turning under the sides. My back tack got a little bit big there. Nobody's going to notice. Okay, right across the top. Okay, I'm done. Awesome. Okay, here's my finished pocket. It has a few problems, right? That thread looks terrible. These giant back tacks just will not do. I missed an edge there and here. My edges are all twisted and crooked, like wiggly. I didn't get right up to the top corners there, and I've got threads everywhere. So let me show you how you can improve that. So for my good hoodie pocket, I gave it a quick little iron to get rid of any wrinkles, and I've serged the edges straight. So now I'll be able to fold them down. They'll just fit in there nicely, and I can press those edges flat. I'll trim my serger tails because those edges aren't going to be serged later, and I can stick a few pins in there. And now with matching thread, I'll be able to just sew on that serged edge nice and straight. I still want to use a guideline though to make sure I'm nice and even. So if I find a spot on my needle plate that looks like that'll work for me, then I'll use that as my guideline the whole way. There, so I'm nice and straight with the edge. Beautiful. And then I'll press those edges just as they are to set the thread and make my edge just look so good. And then I'll turn just a pinky finger fold across the top. Nice and straight. You can definitely measure this, but once you've been sewing a long time, your eyeballing is going to get to be pretty good. A little folded edge on the side. And when we press, it's heat, steam, and pressure. That's what gives you a nice crease. And trim threads as we go. Okay, so that pocket's ready to go on. I'm going to fold in half, give myself a little notch at the center front. And that's ready. So if this is the front of my hoodie, I need a little notch at the center of that as well. And then I can just match up my notch to my notch. And that's how I can get this centered. The raw edges go together. That's where the ribbing is going to be. And now I'll sew straight across the top, nice and close to the edge, and side, bottom, side. Now, if I sew too far away from this fold, it's going to be able to come out. So I want to sew it nice and close to the edge of that fold. So this is where I can use that little notch on my presser foot, right in the center of my presser foot. And I want to guide that little notch to be just on top of my edge there. A nice small back tack here because this one's going to show. And another back tack right at the end there. Same idea on the sides. And then I can pivot to come across the bottom. Now the bottom edge is different. The only reason I'm sewing here is to make the ribbing step easier. I just want to kind of control those two edges together. This line of stitching I'm doing is not going to show, but if I go too far away from the edge, it will show. So I need to stay close to the edge, but perhaps not as close as I was doing here. So for my guideline now is I'm just letting that toe of the presser foot hang over the edge. So my edge of my fabric is going right here. One more stitch to get me right to that edge.
and then pivot and come up. And I don't want to stop before I get to the edge. I definitely want to secure that corner. So I'll come right to the top and do a tiny back tack. That's it. After that gets a final press, it's going to be beautiful. Okay, you're probably not impressed yet because there's yucky threads and my stitching looks a little wiggly, but watch the magic of a good press. Right? I am telling you, you can do that. And it's so satisfying. Oh, it's beautiful. So if this is where your sewing is right now, do not fret. You can improve this. You can bring your sewing from this to this by just improving in those 10 areas. If you make improvements in all 10 of those areas, you're on fire. You've just gone from being a beginner to being great. Okay, so I really hope that helps you build your skills, elevate your sewing, gain some confidence in your work, and be proud of the things that you make. That's the goal, and that's the beauty of sewing. I hope you enjoyed today's video, and I look forward to seeing you again. And until next time on Catherine Sews, you take care.